This is the story of a steel plate, a few feet wide, and what happened the moment it dropped on the most contested beaches of the Second World War. Every fact, every number, every name you're about to hear comes from verified historical records, and none of it has been invented to make the story more dramatic, because the story is already dramatic enough on its own. Attacking an enemy-held coastline from the sea was, before a certain invention came along, close to an unsolvable problem. Your troops are on the boat. The enemy is on shore. At some point, those troops have to cross the water and reach dry ground, and during that crossing, they are completely exposed. No cover, no concealment, nowhere to go. The early landing craft the Allies relied on, designated LCP, L, carried no front ramp at all. To get off the boat, soldiers climbed over the sides, dropped into the water, and waded toward shore while carrying dozens of kilograms of equipment in rough surf. On the beach above them, German machine gun positions tracked every movement. Each man who climbed over that gunwale became a slow-moving, waterlogged, fully loaded target. Not a tactic, a killing sequence. Everyone knew the design was killing people. The Navy knew it. Marine Corps commanders knew it. The men who survived knew it. The question was what to do about it, and the answer, when it finally arrived, came from the last place anyone expected. It came from the enemy. In 1937, Japanese forces pushed into China, and along the Yangtze River, a young U.S. Marine Corps lieutenant named Victor Brute Krulak watched them do it. What caught his attention wasn't the fighting, it was the boats. Japanese landing craft carried a hinged ramp at the bow. Soldiers didn't climb over anything. The ramp dropped, and an entire line of men charged straight onto shore. Krulak pulled out paper and drew what he saw, wrote down every detail he could capture, and carried those sketches back to the United States. Years later, he briefed Marine Corps Lieutenant General Holland, Howlin' Mad Smith, brought a modified model of a landing craft, and made the case that this ramp design needed to exist in American hands. Getting it built required a boat builder named Andrew Jackson Higgins. Higgins ran out of New Orleans, Irish-tempered and relentlessly driven, a man who had started in the lumber business and pivoted to boat construction after his transport company collapsed in 1930. Through the 1930s, his company refined a shallow draft workboat called the Eureka, purpose-built for Louisiana's bayous and oil field swamps. That boat could run through 18 inches of water, push through vegetation without fouling its propeller, drive straight onto a muddy bank, and back itself off without damage. Those qualities, developed for swamp work, turned out to map almost perfectly onto what a military landing craft needed to do. In April 1941, Krulak arrived at a meeting in Quantico, carrying a photograph of a Japanese landing vessel, sat down with Higgins, and walked him through the ramp concept. Higgins absorbed it, went to work on the integration, and on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, he filed for a patent. That timing is worth sitting with for a moment. On the same day the United States formally entered the war, the device that would carry its soldiers onto enemy beaches was being registered with the U.S. Patent Office. Patent number 2. 1,341,866. The finished design carried the designation LCVP, Landing Craft Vehicle and Personnel, though history remembers it simply as the Higgins boat. Over 36 feet long and nearly 11 feet wide, built from oak, pine, and mahogany, with a steel ramp at the bow, the craft drew just over 2 feet of water at the front and 3 feet at the stern. That shallow draft let it drive directly onto a beach. The steel ramp dropped, soldiers ran off, and within 3 to 4 minutes, the boat could complete its unload, reverse off the sand, and head back to the supply ship for the next group. The craft held 36 fully armed soldiers, or a jeep, and 12 men, or 8,000 pounds of cargo. 2 gunners operated .30 caliber Browning machine guns from positions at the rear. The coxswain drove from the port side beside the engine. What the design did not provide was protection. The sides were laminated plywood. Against machine gun fire, they offered nothing. 36 men packed together in a flat-bottomed box moving at 12 knots meant that a single well-placed burst could cause catastrophic casualties. And the moment of maximum exposure was always the same: the instant the ramp went down. Before that moment, the steel ramp served as a barrier. After it, a line of men stood in open space, facing whatever was waiting on the shore. In Higgins's New Orleans factories, banners hung from the rafters reading, "The guy who relaxes is helping the Axis." From a single boatyard with fewer than 75 employees in 1938, the operation expanded to 7 plants, employing more than 25,000 workers by the end of 1943. Higgins ran the first racially integrated workforce in New Orleans, paying equal wages to white workers, black workers, women, elderly employees, and workers with disabilities alike. And that workforce responded by shattering production record after production record. By 1943, 9 out of every 10 vessels in the U.S. Navy carried a Higgins Industries design. By war's end, those factories had produced more than 20,000 boats across all types, including 12,500 LCVPs. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the United States produced 23,398 LCVPs across the entire war. The Higgins boats, combined with those built by licensed manufacturers, landed more Allied troops than every other type of landing craft put together. The Higgins boat saw action at Guadalcanal in North Africa and at Salerno before the war reached its most critical amphibious test. That test arrived in November 1943 at a coral atoll in the Gilbert Islands called Tarawa. Betio Island, at the southwest corner of Tarawa Atoll, measured less than 0.6 of a square mile, and the Japanese had turned every inch of it into a fortified killing ground. American planners calculated the assault would take 1 day. It took 3, and the reason the timeline collapsed traces back to a single miscalculation. U.S. planners had badly misjudged the timing of high tide at Betio. When the follow-on waves of landing craft arrived, the water over the coral reef sat far lower than predicted. Boats grounded hundreds of yards from shore. Marines climbed out into chest-deep water and walked toward the beach with no cover, and nothing between them and Japanese machine guns but open water and daylight. By the time the island was declared secure, 1,009 Marines had been killed and 2,101 wounded on a piece of land smaller than most city parks. Tarawa produced lessons that fed directly into the next generation of equipment. The LVT-4 amphibious tractor, which debuted at Saipan in June 1944, relocated its engine from the forward section to a position just behind the crew cabin, freeing up the rear of the vehicle for a loading ramp. Soldiers could now enter and exit without climbing over the sides. Each improvement in the design carried the same logic. Every unnecessary exposure was a death that could have been prevented. The largest amphibious operation in history launched before dawn on June 6, 1944, under the codename Operation Overlord. More than 7,000 naval vessels took part, including 4,000 landing craft and 1,200 warships, with roughly 12,000 aircraft providing support overhead. Close to 160,000 Allied troops would land that day across 5 beaches on the coast of Normandy, France. Among those 5 beaches, Omaha carried the worst odds from the beginning. The terrain there had been shaped over centuries into something that functioned like a natural defensive structure. 300 to 400 yards of flat, featureless sand stretched from the waterline to a low stone embankment no more than 3 feet high. Bluffs rose above the sand. German engineers had filled the approaches with wooden stakes tipped with mines, steel hedgehog obstacles designed to rip the hulls of landing craft at high tide, and 85 machine gun positions configured to deliver overlapping fields of fire across the entire beach. At 3:10 in the morning, the first soldiers began climbing down rope netting from their transport ships into Higgins boats, bobbing in the darkness below. By 4:30 a.m., every first-wave landing craft had left the ships. At 5 a.m., Allied naval guns and aircraft opened bombardment on the German defenses. The bombardment went on for a substantial period of time and accomplished very little. Aircraft dropped their loads miles inland, tearing up empty fields and killing French livestock, while the German concrete bunkers absorbed the naval fire and remained intact. The defenders waited, untouched, and rested for the ramps to open. At 6 a.m., the Higgins boats closed on the coastline near Vierville. Inside the hulls, soldiers could already hear the sound of machine gun rounds striking the raised steel ramps in front of them. At 6:36 a.m., 5 surviving craft from Company A, 1st Battalion, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division dropped their ramps at Dog Green Sector, directly opposite the ravine exit leading toward Vierville-sur-Mer. That ravine was one of the most heavily defended points on the entire beach. The German guns had waited for the ramps to go down. Dog Green offered no shell craters, no rubble, no natural breaks in the flat open sand. One British assault landing craft absorbed 4 direct hits and blew apart before its soldiers reached the water. Men rushing off the LCVPs were cut apart by machine gun fire. Those who jumped over the gunnels were pulled under by the weight of their packs and equipment and drowned. Every officer in Company A became a casualty, along with most of the non-commissioned officers. 10 minutes after those ramps dropped, Company A had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. They had not reached the Vierville exit. Most of them had not fired a single shot. A 64-man Ranger company that followed Company A into the same sector lost half its men. Company A lost 2/3. The final overall casualty rate for Company A reached 96%. Among the dead were 19 men from Bedford, Virginia, a town of roughly 3,200 people in 1944. Proportionally, Bedford absorbed the heaviest D-Day losses of any community in the United States. Farther east, at Easy Red and Fox Green, scattered elements of 3 companies had been cut to half strength by the time survivors crawled to the relative shelter of the stone embankment, most of them covering roughly 270 meters of open sand just ahead of the rising tide. By 8:30 a.m., all landings at Omaha had stopped. One account from that morning captures what it felt like to be on the craft side of that steel door. A Higgins boat operator who survived D-Day recalled in an interview years later that his original assignment had been to man one of the .30 caliber machine guns aboard his craft. A few weeks before the invasion, those guns were removed. Commanders worried about friendly fire. He recalled telling his interviewer, "There was not friendly fire. The only fire was from the Germans, and it wasn't very friendly. His new job was operating the ramp." "I didn't want to drop the ramp," he said, his voice breaking. "I knew once I dropped the ramp, the machine gun bullets that was hitting it will come into my boat." The coxswain ordered him to lower it anyway. The first time the ramp went down, 3 soldiers got off the boat and onto the beach, where they met the same fate as those before them. The second time, 7 or 8 made it off. "To me, that was progress, from 3 to 8, he said. "I figured if I could keep this up, maybe I could get somebody on that beach." Between runs, his crew used grappling hooks to pull the dead and wounded from the water, loading them onto the boat to carry back to the ship. 6 Higgins boats from his group were lost that day. All the crews survived. Each boat ran the route more than a dozen times. "At the end of the day," he said, "there were 2,000 mothers whose sons were not going to come home." General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, watched the morning unfold from the heavy cruiser USS Augusta. By 8:30, Omaha had become a landscape of burning vehicles and men who had reached the absolute edge of what human beings can endure under fire. The plan was dead. Bradley that morning seriously considered abandoning Omaha entirely and redirecting the remaining landing waves toward Utah Beach. What changed the outcome wasn't a command decision from above. Small groups of soldiers, on a beach where almost all their officers and sergeants were already dead or wounded, began moving on their own initiative toward the bluffs on the flanks. By noon, German defensive fire had noticeably weakened as positions were taken from the rear. Exit after exit was forced open. By nightfall, the 1st and 29th Divisions held ground near Vierville, Saint-Laurent, and Colville, nowhere near the planned objectives, but a foothold had been secured. Total American casualties at Omaha on June 6th reached approximately 2,400. The Allies suffered more than 10,300 casualties across all 5 beaches combined. 1/3 of all D-Day losses occurred on the flats and bluffs of Omaha Beach. Army historian S.L.A. Marshall, who served as the U.S. Army's chief combat historian, described the first hours at Omaha as an epic human tragedy, which in the early hours bordered on total disaster. Not every soldier who landed at Normandy came ashore through an American LCVP. British and Canadian forces, along with American Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, used a different craft, the Landing Craft Assault, or LCA, designed by John the Firth Thornycroft Limited of Woolston, Hampshire. Both the LCA and the LCVP carried roughly 30 to 36 fully equipped infantry. Beyond that, the two designs reflected genuinely different priorities. The LCA carried armor. Its side bulkheads and walls were plated with 3/4-inch steel, and its upper decks with a 1/4-inch layer, enough to stop rifle bullets and low-velocity shell fragments. Before soldiers walked out through the forward ramp, they passed through a second set of armored doors, an additional barrier that the LCVP simply did not include. The LCA also ran on silenced engines, having originally been designed for covert raiding operations, and its low silhouette made it harder to spot from shore. The trade-offs were real. Low freeboard meant the LCA shipped water more easily in heavy seas, and on D-Day, some were swamped in the rough channel conditions. Its top speed of about 8 knots was slower than the Higgins boat. The armor added weight and reduced cargo capacity. 2 designs, 2 sets of choices about what to protect and what to sacrifice. Neither was unconditionally superior. Both carried men towards the same beaches and paid the same kind of price. Andrew Jackson Higgins died on August 1, 1952, and was buried at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans. Higgins Industries continued operating after his death and closed in 1963. He had filed 30 patents related to amphibious landing craft and vehicles before he died. His total wartime output reached 20,094 boats, a production record for which Higgins Industries received the Army-Navy E Award, the highest honor the armed forces could present to a civilian manufacturer, multiple times. Dwight D. Eisenhower, in a 1964 interview with author Stephen Ambrose, put it plainly, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." Marine Corps Colonel Joseph H. Alexander, retired, offered a more technical framing of the same judgment. The Higgins boats broke the gridlock on the ship-to-shore movement. It is impossible to overstate the tactical advantages this craft gave U.S. amphibious commanders in World War II. In 2000, the National World War II Museum opened in New Orleans on Andrew Higgins Drive. In May 2019, Higgins was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. The restored Higgins boat displayed outside the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, that year drew visitors who could climb aboard and stand in the space where 36 soldiers once stood before a ramp dropped and the world outside came rushing in. 7 decades after the war ended, the Pentagon still relied in substantial measure on flat-bottomed landing craft with hinged bow ramps to carry troops and equipment in the critical hours following a beach assault. The basic logic Higgins built into his design, drive onto the shore, drop the ramp, discharge, reverse out, return for more, had proven too effective to replace with anything fundamentally different. Modern air cushion landing craft, the LCAC, carry 60 to 75 tons of payload at speeds over 40 knots, access more than 70% of the world's coastline compared to the roughly 15% reachable by conventional boat-type craft, and carry both forward and rear ramps to shorten unloading time. They can launch from beyond visual range of the shore, leaving an enemy unable to determine where or when a landing force will arrive. The technology moved forward. The ramp stayed. This video began with a steel plate a few feet wide. Before that plate existed, soldiers climbed over the sides of boats and became targets the moment they were visible. The design produced systematic casualties, and everyone who encountered it in combat understood why. When Victor Krulak brought back a sketch of a Japanese ramp from the Yangtze River in 1937, and when Andrew Higgins filed a patent on December 8, 1941, they weren't refining a minor technical detail. They were changing the odds that a man stepping off a boat would still be alive 30 seconds later. On June 6, 1944, at Dog Green Sector of Omaha Beach, Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment had a 96% casualty rate within 10 minutes of their ramps going down. 34,000 Americans landed at Omaha that same day. The Allies held a foothold in France by nightfall. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the distance between them is measured in the decisions embedded in that steel plate. Where it dropped, how fast, in what depth of water, in front of what defenses. Design is not abstract. In the hands of soldiers on a hostile beach, a hinge and a steel plate and a few feet of clearance is the difference between a door that protects you until the last possible moment and a ladder that exposes you from the first. The men who climbed those ramps on D-Day carried that difference in their bodies. The door came down. Some of them made it. Many did not. And the distance between those two outcomes is the story of how a war gets fought and won and paid for.